Jim Perkins was dying, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. Still, he trudged along the shore of what he was fairly certain was Lake Erie, or some version of it, his dull and soiled loafers sinking into the moist, compacted sand beneath him with each step, as they left behind nearly perfect impressions of the shoes' bespoke soles and heels that he knew nobody else would ever see. When he'd first arrived in the blasted landscape that was this world's version of East Liverpool, Ohio, almost a month prior, Jim still largely looked the part of the successful, middle-aged bank manager he'd been, sporting a fine, tailored three-piece suit and carefully selected accessories that included an impressive pair of shimmering, silver cufflinks, only surpassed by the impeccable shine on his handcrafted shoes. Now, the cufflinks were the only part of him that retained any measure of their former splendor, his loafers having been soaked and scuffed more times than he could recall, and his vest and suit jacket long abandoned as articles of clothing, in favor of their far more useful roles as makeshift blankets. His dress shirt was thoroughly stained, having been used dozens of times as a crude filter in efforts to remove the worst elements of the water they'd been forced to drink from the lake, with no other alternative. Moreover, his tie, which he'd rolled up and crammed into his trouser pocket, while it had still been clean enough to potentially serve as a bandage or tourniquet, hadn't seen the light of day in weeks, leaving his seemingly ever-shrinking, hairy neck exposed behind the open-top button of the shirt he no longer bothered to fasten. In short, Jim Perkins looked less like the professional businessman he'd been, and more like an extra from a post-apocalyptic zombie film. Jim had always been a large man, carrying more than a little extra weight for decades, which had undoubtedly helped to keep him alive as the days and weeks had ticked by, but even he had become significantly emaciated and almost fatally weakened from malnourishment, his distended gut drooping below his waistline between his suspenders, which he now had to adjust almost daily to keep his filthy, stained, pinstriped trousers in place. That said, he was better off than Liz, still able to walk and, more importantly, forage for the only morsels of food they'd managed to find. There was a part of Jim that wanted to simply collapse, face down in the dirt, and die. He'd been through so much, and he knew they were likely being as much poisoned as sustained by the bits of food and water they were forcing themselves to choke down in a way that was almost certainly only prolonging their suffering, and ensuring that their final moments would only be that much more excruciating and terrifying. Still, two things kept him going. First and foremost, Jim had promised Liz that he would come back, regardless of whether or not he found what he was looking for, and after everything they'd been through, he knew with absolute certainty that he would never break that promise. Death might well take him and leave him rotting on that beach in the remnants of his fancy suit and shoes, but if that happened, he would die knowing he'd done everything he could to keep his word. It was the one thing he had left that he was truly sure of, and he clung to it like a drowning man clutching a life preserver. Beyond that, a somewhat smaller but still quite significant part of Jim wanted to live, if only to spite the unknown heartless bastards who'd deposited them in this hell, this faded echo of the world they'd known. He'd concluded fairly soon after his arrival that there was a good chance whoever, or whatever had stranded them, might well come back to check on their progress, if they survived long enough to merit it, and that belief hadn't wavered. Objectively, Jim knew they were already in no shape to mount a meaningful defense, or exact any sort of payback for what had been done to them, but the big man was no quitter, and if there was any chance for them to live another day and possibly do more, he would take it, or die trying. Thus, Jim Perkins shambled along, an empty plastic water bottle dangling from the fingertips of his right hand. "Nobody likes me," he softly sang, nearly delirious as he scanned the ground in front of him for any sign of what he was seeking. Another step. "Everybody hates me."